The wedding hall was full of laughter, music, and expensive clothes. At the center of it all stood Emily Carter, smiling beside her new husband. Everyone looked happy. Everyone except the man standing near the back wall. His name was Daniel Carter. He was Emily's older brother. And for most of the evening his own family had treated him like a stranger. Daniel stood quietly in a simple black suit. It was clean and well-fitted, but it was not expensive. He wore an old silver watch on his wrist. There was nothing flashy about him. He had come to the wedding because Emily was his sister. That was enough for him. At least it had been enough when he arrived. Now he was beginning to wonder if coming had been a mistake. Daniel watched as his father, Richard, moved from table to table. Richard was smiling. He shook hands with wealthy guests. He laughed loudly at jokes that were not funny. He wanted everyone to believe the Carter family was important. Then Richard saw Daniel. His smile disappeared. He walked across the room. "You need to move," Richard said quietly. Daniel looked at him. "Move where?" "Anywhere away from the main tables." Daniel frowned. "This is my sister's wedding." "I know. Then why can't I sit with the family?" Richard glanced around. Several guests were watching them. "Because Mark's business partners are here," he whispered. "People who matter." Daniel looked toward the front table. His sister Emily was sitting beside Mark, her new husband. "People who matter?" Daniel asked. "Richard Zeit. Don't make this difficult." Daniel said nothing. He picked up his glass and walked toward the far side of the room. His father followed him for a few steps. "Daniel." Daniel stopped. Richard lowered his voice. "Please don't embarrass the family tonight." Daniel turned slowly. "How am I embarrassing the family?" Richard did not answer. That silence told Daniel everything. Richard walked away. Daniel stood alone. For a moment he remembered being a child. Emily had been 8 years old when Daniel was 16. Their parents had been fighting constantly. Whenever things became bad, Emily would hide in Daniel's room. Daniel would sit beside her until she stopped crying. He had always protected her. Even when he left home. Even when he joined the army. Even when years passed without much contact. He had never stopped thinking of her as his little sister. That was why he had come tonight. He wanted to see her happy. He wanted to tell her that he was proud of her. Instead he was being hidden. A few minutes later, Emily walked toward him. Her wedding dress moved softly across the floor. Daniel smiled. "Congratulations." Emily smiled back, but there was tension in her face. "Thank you." Daniel reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small gift box. "I brought this for you." Emily opened it. Inside was an old silver necklace. Her eyes widened. "You still had this?" Daniel smiled. "Mom gave it to me when I was 17. She told me to keep it safe." Emily touched the necklace. Daniel continued. "I thought you should have it." For a moment, Emily looked like the little girl he remembered. Then she looked toward the crowd. Her smile faded. "Daniel, I need to ask you something." "What?" "Can you stay away from the family photographs?" Daniel stared at her. "Why?" "Mark's parents invited some very important people." Daniel waited. Emily looked uncomfortable. "They don't know much about you." Daniel almost laughed. "They don't know much about me?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Emily lowered her voice. "People might ask questions." "What questions?" She looked down. "About what you do." Daniel was silent. Emily finally said it. "They think you have a normal government job." Daniel looked at his sister. "They?" "Mark's family." "And what do you think?" Emily did not answer. Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand." Emily reached for his arm. "Please don't be angry." "I'm not angry." But his voice was quieter now. Emily walked away. Daniel watched her return to the main table. Then a man stepped in front of him. Mark. Emily's new husband. Mark was wearing a perfect black tuxedo. His watch probably cost more than Daniel's car. He looked Daniel over. "So you're the famous brother." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Famous?" Mark smiled. "Emily mentioned you." "What did she say?" Mark laughed. "Not much." Daniel said nothing. Mark looked at his suit. "Nice outfit." There was something insulting in his voice. "Thanks." Mark took a drink. "I heard you work for the government." "I do." "Must be boring." "Sometimes." Mark smiled. "Well, at least you came." He walked away. 2 men nearby laughed. Daniel did not react. He had learned a long time ago that silence could say more than anger. Still, something inside him hurt. Not because of Mark. Because Emily had allowed it. Daniel looked toward his mother. Linda was sitting at the main table. She had watched everything. She did not come over. She did not defend him. She simply looked away. That hurt more. Daniel stepped outside. The cool evening air felt better than the crowded room. He stood near the hotel entrance and looked at the city lights. His phone vibrated. A message appeared. "Sir, we have arrived." Daniel read it once. Then again. He put the phone away. A few seconds later, a black SUV stopped in front of the hotel. The rear door opened. A man in a military uniform stepped out. He was older than Daniel, with gray hair and a serious face. He looked toward the entrance. Then he entered the hotel. Daniel watched from outside. He knew exactly who the man was. And he knew why he had come. The officer walked to the front desk. "Excuse me," he said. The receptionist looked up. "I'm looking for Colonel Daniel Carter." The receptionist checked the wedding list. "Colonel?" "Yes." She looked confused. "There is a Carter family wedding tonight." "That's the one." "Is Colonel Carter a guest?" The officer nodded. "He's here." The receptionist pointed toward the ballroom. The officer thanked her. Then he walked inside. Daniel remained outside. He looked through the glass doors. He could see the officer moving toward the ballroom. Inside, Richard was laughing with Mark's father. Neither man noticed the officer. Emily was talking with her new husband. Then the officer stopped. He looked across the room. His eyes found Daniel through the glass. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The officer immediately changed direction. He walked straight toward the entrance. Daniel knew what was coming. But he also knew something else. His family had spent the entire evening making one dangerous mistake. They had confused Daniel's silence with weakness. The ballroom doors opened. The officer stepped outside. Daniel looked at him. The officer stood perfectly straight. Then he raised his hand. He gave Daniel a formal military salute. Daniel returned it. Inside the ballroom, Richard suddenly noticed. His smile disappeared. Mark turned around. Emily looked toward the doors. Everyone began watching. The officer lowered his hand. "Sir," he said quietly, "the unit is waiting for your decision." Daniel looked back at the wedding hall. His family was staring at him. For the first time that night, they were not looking at him with embarrassment. They were looking at him with confusion. And soon they would have questions. A lot of questions. Because the brother they had been ashamed of was not the man they thought he was. And the biggest secret of all was still hidden. The ballroom had gone strangely quiet. Daniel stood near the entrance. Beside him stood the army officer who had just saluted him. Inside, hundreds of wedding guests were staring. Nobody seemed to understand what had just happened. Richard Carter was the first to move. He walked quickly toward the entrance. "What is going on?" he asked. The officer looked at him. "Sir, I need to speak with Colonel Carter." Richard frowned. "Colonel?" The officer nodded. Daniel remained silent. Richard looked at his son. Then back at the officer. "You must have the wrong person." The officer did not answer. Daniel finally spoke. "Major Lewis, it's fine." The officer looked at Daniel. "Sir, headquarters needs your answer." Daniel nodded. "I'll deal with it later." Major Lewis looked confused. "Sir, they said it was urgent." "I understand." Daniel glanced toward the ballroom. "This is my sister's wedding." The major looked at Emily. Then he understood. "Of course, sir." He stepped aside. Richard was still staring at Daniel. "What kind of job do you actually have?" he asked. Daniel looked at him. "The kind that requires privacy." Richard's face became red. "Don't play games with me." "I'm not." Mark walked over. He had been watching from across the room. He smiled. "This is getting ridiculous." Daniel looked at him. Mark pointed toward the officer. "Are we really supposed to believe this?" Major Lewis said nothing. Mark laughed. "Daniel works for the government. That's what everyone knows." Daniel did not correct him. Mark continued. "Now suddenly he's some kind of military commander?" Several guests began whispering. Richard looked relieved. "Exactly," he said. He turned toward the crowd. "There has been a misunderstanding." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. His father continued. "My son has always had a habit of making ordinary things sound important." Daniel looked at him. For a moment he said nothing. He could have ended the confusion right there. He could have told everyone exactly who he was. But he remembered why he had come. Emily was standing beside Mark. She looked frightened. Daniel did not want to destroy her wedding. So he stayed quiet. Major Lewis looked at Daniel. Daniel gave him a small nod. The officer stepped away. "I'll wait outside, sir." Daniel nodded. The major walked through the doors. The room slowly returned to its normal noise. But the tension remained. Richard moved closer to Daniel. "You embarrassed me." Daniel almost smiled. "I embarrassed you? You let that man walk in here and create a scene. He came looking for me. Then you should have handled it privately." Daniel looked at his father. "I tried." Richard lowered his voice. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Make everything about yourself." Daniel stared at him. He could not believe what he was hearing. His father had pushed him away all evening. Now he was blaming him for being noticed. Before Daniel could respond, Emily stepped between them. "Please." Her voice was shaking. "Not tonight." Daniel looked at her. "You're right." He stepped back. "I don't want to ruin your night." Emily looked relieved. But then Mark walked to the microphone. Daniel turned. Mark tapped the microphone. The music stopped. Everyone looked toward him. "Thank you all for being here tonight." He smiled. "This has been an incredible day." The guests applauded. Daniel stood near the back. He thought Mark was going to make a normal wedding speech. He was wrong. Mark raised his glass. "Marriage is about building a better future." He looked toward his parents. Then toward Emily's family. "And sometimes that means leaving the past behind." A few people laughed. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Mark continued. "Some people spend their whole lives talking about what they might become." He paused. "But other people actually build something." The laughter grew louder. Daniel understood. The speech was about him. Emily looked at Mark. "Mark, stop." He smiled. "I'm only joking." Daniel looked toward his mother. Linda was smiling. His father was laughing. Daniel felt something inside him become very quiet. Not angry. Not broken. Just finished. Mark continued. "Every family has that one person who takes a different path." He looked directly at Daniel. "The person who disappears for years." More laughter. "The person who comes back wearing a cheap suit and expects everyone to act impressed." Daniel's jaw tightened. Emily stood up. "That's enough." Mark looked surprised. "Emily." "I said enough." The room went quiet. Daniel looked at his sister. For the first time that night she was defending him. But Richard stood up. "Emily, sit down." She looked at her father. "No." Richard's face hardened. "This is your wedding." "I know." "Then don't make a scene." Emily looked at Daniel. Her eyes filled with tears. "I already did." Daniel felt the weight of those words. He knew. She finally knew what they had done. Daniel walked toward her. "You don't have to defend me." "But I should have." Daniel nodded. He wanted to say more. Then his phone vibrated. He checked the screen. Another message. "Sir, the team has received the update. They are standing by." Daniel locked the phone. Mark noticed. He laughed. "Another government email?" Daniel looked at him. "Something like that." Mark shook his head. "You know what your problem is?" Daniel waited. "You think being mysterious makes you important." Several guests laughed again. Daniel said nothing. Then Richard made his biggest mistake. He walked toward the microphone. "I think everyone should understand something." Daniel turned toward him. Richard spoke loudly. "My son is not some high-ranking officer." The ballroom became silent. "He works a normal government job." Daniel stared at his father. Richard continued. "He's always been secretive. He likes people to think he's more successful than he is." Daniel could feel hundreds of eyes on him. This was no longer a private family problem. His father had made it public. Daniel looked at Emily. She looked ashamed. Not of Daniel. Of her family. Richard pointed toward the back doors. "Daniel, maybe you should leave." Daniel nodded. "Maybe I should." He walked toward the exit. Emily followed. "Daniel, wait." He stopped. She reached him. "I'm sorry." Daniel looked at her. "Don't apologize for him." "I'm apologizing for me." Daniel was quiet. Emily whispered, "I should have stopped this earlier." He nodded. "You should have." Her eyes filled with tears. Then Daniel noticed something behind her. Major Lewis was standing near the entrance. But he was no longer alone. Two more officers stood beside him. Both wore formal military uniforms. They were waiting. Daniel looked at them. Then at Emily. "Go back inside." "Daniel. Please." She hesitated. Then she walked away. Daniel stepped outside. The night air was cold. Major Lewis approached him. Sir. Daniel looked at him. What? The general is on the phone. Daniel sighed. Now. He says he needs your decision tonight. Daniel looked through the glass doors. His family was still watching. Richard was talking to Mark. Mark was laughing. They had no idea what was happening outside. Major Lewis handed Daniel the phone. Daniel listened. His expression became serious. He answered with only a few words. Understood. He ended the call. Major Lewis waited. What's the decision, sir? Daniel looked back at the ballroom. I'll stay. The major nodded. For how long? Daniel looked at his family. Until my sister's wedding is over. Then he added quietly. After that I'll deal with everything else. Major Lewis gave a small nod. Understood. Daniel turned toward the ballroom doors. But before he could walk inside, a black vehicle pulled up outside the hotel. A senior army officer stepped out. He looked around. Then he saw Daniel. The officer immediately straightened. He walked toward him. Daniel recognized him. It was General Harris. The man commanded the entire operation Daniel had been preparing for. General Harris stopped in front of Daniel. Colonel. Daniel nodded. General. Harris looked through the glass doors. He saw Richard. He saw Mark. He saw Emily. Then he looked back at Daniel. Is this your family? Daniel paused. Yes. The general studied his face. Do they know? Daniel shook his head. No. General Harris gave a quiet nod. Then he said something Daniel never expected. Then tonight may be the right time. Daniel looked at him. For what? The general's eyes moved toward the ballroom. To let them finally understand who they have been humiliating. Daniel said nothing. Inside the ballroom, Richard raised his glass again. He was still laughing. He still believed his son was nobody. He still believed Daniel had no power. But that was about to change. Because the man standing outside the ballroom was not just an army officer. He was Daniel's commanding general. And he had come to personally recognize Daniel in front of everyone. The doors were about to open. And this time Daniel would not be able to hide the truth. The ballroom doors opened. Every conversation stopped. General Harris walked inside first. Daniel followed him. Behind them came Major Lewis and two other officers. The guests turned in their seats. Nobody understood what was happening. Richard stood near the main table with a glass in his hand. His face slowly lost its color. Mark looked at Emily. What's going on? Emily did not answer. She was staring at her brother. Daniel walked calmly into the room. He did not look angry. He did not look proud. He simply looked tired. General Harris stopped near the center of the ballroom. Then he turned toward Daniel. Colonel Carter. Daniel stepped forward. Sir. Harris looked at the guests. I apologize for interrupting this wedding. He paused. But there are people in this room who need to understand who they have been speaking to tonight. A nervous silence filled the room. Richard placed his glass on the table. General, I think there has been some mistake. Harris looked at him. No mistake. Richard swallowed. My son is not a colonel. Harris looked at Daniel. Then back at Richard. Your son has served for more than a decade. Richard shook his head. He works for the government. Harris gave a small nod. He does. Richard looked confused. Harris continued. He also commands Army Rangers. A wave of whispers moved through the room. Mark stopped smiling. Emily covered her mouth. Linda stared at Daniel. Daniel said nothing. Richard looked at his son. Why didn't you tell us? Daniel took a slow breath. I tried. Richard shook his head. No, you didn't. Daniel looked at him. Did you ever ask? Richard had no answer. Daniel continued. When I came home after my first deployment, you asked how much money I was making. Richard looked down. When I came home after the next one, you asked why I never brought home a girlfriend. Daniel paused. When I received my promotion, I tried to tell you. Richard looked up. Daniel's voice stayed calm. You told me you were busy. Linda suddenly spoke. Daniel, we didn't know. Daniel looked at his mother. You didn't want to know. Her eyes filled with tears. Mark stepped forward. This doesn't prove anything. Everyone looked at him. Mark continued. People can have military titles. That doesn't mean. General Harris cut him off. Mr. Bennett. Mark stopped. Harris looked directly at him. Do you know what it means to command Rangers? Mark said nothing. Harris continued. It means hundreds of soldiers trust that person with their lives. The room became silent. It means families trust him to bring their sons and daughters home. Harris looked at Daniel. And he has carried that responsibility for years. Daniel lowered his eyes. He did not want praise. That was never why he served. He remembered the soldiers he had lost. He remembered the families he had called. He remembered the nights when sleep would not come. He had never told his parents those things. Not because he was ashamed. Because some memories were too heavy to explain. Emily slowly walked toward him. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel looked at her. You never asked. I should have. Yes. Emily began crying. I thought you were just. She stopped. Daniel waited. Just what? Emily looked away. Different. Daniel nodded. I was. She looked at him. I was different because my life was different. Emily wiped her eyes. I am sorry. Daniel did not answer. Richard suddenly stepped forward. This is unbelievable. Everyone turned toward him. Richard looked at General Harris. Why would a general come here for my son? Harris answered simply. Because your son is one of the most trusted officers under my command. Richard stared at Daniel. But he never told us. Daniel finally spoke. Because every time I came home I was treated like I had failed. Richard's face changed. Daniel continued. You wanted me to have a better job. I wanted you to have a normal life, Richard said. Daniel looked at him. This is my normal life. Richard shook his head. No. This is not what I meant. Daniel gave a small, sad smile. You never asked what I meant. Nobody spoke. Then Mark stepped closer. Emily, we should leave. She looked at him. Why? This is embarrassing. Emily stared at him. No. Mark frowned. What? You are embarrassed because my brother is successful? Mark looked around. That's not what I said. It is. Emily took off her wedding ring for a moment. Not because she was ending the marriage. She simply needed space. She looked at Mark. You made fun of him. Mark said nothing. You called him a nobody. Still nothing. You laughed when my father told him to leave. Mark's face became tense. Emily, this is your wedding. She looked at him. Exactly. Then she turned toward Daniel. I am sorry. Daniel nodded. But he did not hug her. Not yet. There were too many things between them. General Harris quietly stepped aside. He gave Daniel a few seconds. Then he said, there is one more thing. Daniel looked at him. Harris reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small folder. These are the official commendations you received over the years. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Sir, that's not necessary. Harris shook his head. I think it is. He handed the folder to Emily. She looked down. Inside were photographs, boards, letters, official documents. She slowly turned the pages. Then she saw a photograph of Daniel standing beside a group of rangers. He was wearing a uniform. He looked younger. But his eyes were the same. Emily touched the photograph. You really did all this? Daniel nodded. She looked at another page. There was a letter thanking Daniel for bringing several soldiers home safely. Another document mentioned a difficult operation. Another recognized his leadership. Emily began crying again. Richard walked closer. Can I see? Emily handed him the folder. Richard looked through it. His hands began to shake. He stopped at one page. Daniel saw what it was. It was a letter from years earlier. Richard had received a copy. Daniel remembered that day. He had sent it home. He had hoped his father would call. The call never came. Richard looked at the date. You sent this to me. Daniel nodded. I did. Richard looked confused. I don't remember. You never answered. Richard closed his eyes. For the first time that night he looked genuinely ashamed. Daniel looked away. He did not want an apology. Not yet. He needed something else. He needed his family to understand that his silence had never meant weakness. It had meant discipline. Outside, Major Lewis received a message. He walked toward General Harris. Sir. Harris read the message. His expression changed. Daniel noticed. What happened? Harris looked at him. The operation has been approved. Daniel became serious. When? Tomorrow morning. Daniel nodded. Harris lowered his voice. We need you. Daniel looked around the ballroom. His sister was crying. His father was holding the old folder. His mother was staring at the floor. Mark stood alone. Daniel had spent years learning how to leave difficult things behind. But tonight was different. This was family. Harris waited. Do you want to go now? Daniel looked at Emily. Then at Richard. Then at the people who had spent the entire night judging him. He shook his head. No. Harris raised an eyebrow. I'll stay. Are you sure? Daniel nodded. My sister only gets married once. Harris smiled slightly. Then we'll wait. He turned away. Daniel looked at Emily. She walked toward him. This time she did not apologize. She simply hugged him. Daniel stood still for a moment. Then he slowly hugged her back. But just as the room began to calm down, Mark's father stood up. He had been silent the entire time. He looked at Daniel with a serious expression. Then he said something that made everyone turn toward him. Colonel Carter. Daniel looked at him. The older man reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded document. I believe you need to see this. Daniel frowned. What is it? The man looked at Richard. Then at Emily. Finally he looked at Daniel. It concerns your father. Daniel took the document. He unfolded it. His eyes moved across the page. Then he stopped. His face changed. Whatever was written there had nothing to do with the wedding. And everything to do with why his family had treated him differently for years. Daniel looked up. What is this? The older man answered quietly. Something your father never told you. The ballroom went silent again. Daniel looked at Richard. His father could not meet his eyes. And suddenly, Daniel realized that the secret he had been hiding for years might not be the biggest secret in the family after all. Daniel held the folded document in his hand. The ballroom had gone silent again. A few minutes earlier, everyone had learned that Daniel was not the man they thought he was. Now another secret was sitting in his hands. And this one seemed to involve his father. Daniel looked at the older man who had given him the paper. Where did you get this? The man took a slow breath. My name is Robert Bennett. Mark's father. Daniel looked at him. I know who you are. Robert nodded. Then you should know that I did not come here to embarrass your family. He pointed at the document. I brought this because I believe you deserve to know the truth. Daniel unfolded the paper again. It was an old letter. At the top was the name of a military office. Below it was his father's name. Daniel read the first few lines. His face became still. The letter was dated 8 years earlier. It confirmed that Daniel had been selected for a major army leadership position. The letter had been sent to his family address. His father had received it. Daniel looked at Richard. You knew. Richard said nothing. You knew about this. Richard lowered his head. Daniel's voice remained calm. Why did you never tell me? Richard looked at his son. I didn't understand what it meant. Daniel stared at him. You understood enough to hide it. Richard's face tightened. I was afraid. Of what? Richard looked around the room. Of losing you. Daniel shook his head. You already lost me. Richard closed his eyes. Daniel looked back at the letter. There was more. The letter explained that Daniel had been selected to lead a highly trained Army Ranger unit. It also included a request for emergency family contact information. Daniel remembered that period. He had been deployed for months. He had tried to call home. Nobody answered. He had sent messages. Nothing. He had assumed his family was simply busy. Now he understood. Richard had known exactly where Daniel was. He had simply chosen not to tell the rest of the family. Daniel looked at his father. Why? Richard finally spoke. Because your mother was sick with worry. Linda looked up. What? Richard continued. She couldn't handle knowing where you were. Linda stared at him. You told me Daniel was working at a government office. Richard nodded. I thought it would be easier. Daniel's eyes hardened. You lied to her. Richard looked down. I thought I was protecting her. Linda shook her head. No. Her voice was quiet. You were protecting yourself. Richard said nothing. Emily looked between her parents. Why would Dad hide this? Daniel answered. Because he was ashamed. Richard looked at him. That's not true. Daniel stared back. Then tell me the truth. Richard struggled to speak. Finally he did. I wanted you to come home. Daniel's expression softened slightly. Richard continued. Every time you left, I thought you might not come back. Daniel said nothing. I was angry at the army. Richard's voice began to shake. I blamed your career for taking you away from us. Daniel looked down. So instead of telling me you were scared, you made me believe you didn't care. Richard nodded. I made mistakes. More than mistakes. Richard looked at him. I know. For the first time that night, Daniel saw something different in his father's face. Not anger. Not pride. Fear. But Daniel was not ready to forgive him. Not yet. Then Emily spoke. There is still something I don't understand. Everyone looked at her. She pointed at the document. Why did Robert have this? Robert stepped forward. I was involved in a business project with your father several years ago. Daniel turned toward him. What kind of project? Robert hesitated. Richard immediately spoke. That doesn't matter. Daniel looked at his father. Then why are you worried? Richard became silent. Robert answered for him. Your father was trying to sell a piece of family property. Daniel frowned. What property? The old Carter land. Daniel knew the property. It was a small piece of land outside town. It had belonged to Daniel's grandfather. Daniel had spent summers there with Emily. Their father had always told them it was part of the family's future. Robert continued. Your father needed money. Richard interrupted. I had debts. Daniel stared at him. How much? Richard did not answer. Robert gave the number. Almost $400,000. A shocked murmur moved through the room. Linda looked at her husband. You told me we were fine. Richard looked away. Emily shook her head. How could you hide that? Richard's voice was weak. I thought I could fix it. Daniel looked at the document again. There was another page attached. He read it carefully. Then he looked at Robert. Why was my name on this? Robert answered quietly. Because the property was not entirely your father's. Daniel froze. What? Your grandfather left part of it to you. Richard immediately stepped forward. Daniel, listen. Daniel raised a hand. Don't. Richard stopped. Daniel continued reading. His grandfather had left the land to both Daniel and Emily. Their father could not sell it without their approval. Daniel looked at Emily. Did you know? She shook her head. No. Richard looked desperate. I was going to tell you. When? Richard had no answer. Daniel folded the papers. For years his family had treated him like someone who had nothing. But now he was learning that his father had been hiding financial problems. He had hidden military letters. He had hidden property documents. And he had lied to his wife. The humiliation at the wedding suddenly looked different. It was no longer just about Daniel's career. There had been years of lies behind it. Daniel walked toward his father. What else? Richard looked frightened. What? What else have you hidden? Richard said nothing. Daniel waited. The room was silent. Finally Richard whispered. There is one more thing. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What? Richard looked toward Linda. Then toward Emily. I received a letter 3 years ago. What letter? Richard's voice broke. It said Daniel might not come home. Linda covered her mouth. Emily began crying. Daniel stood perfectly still. What did you do? Richard looked at him. I didn't tell anyone. Why? Because I thought you were dead. Daniel's face changed. The room became completely silent. Richard continued. I got the message during one of your missions. Daniel remembered that mission. It had been one of the hardest periods of his career. His unit had been trapped. Several soldiers had been injured. Daniel had survived. He had returned home weeks later. But when he called his family, nobody answered. He had assumed they were angry with him. Now he understood. His father had believed he was dead. And instead of telling the family, Richard had buried the truth. Daniel's voice became quiet. You let me come home to a family that thought I had abandoned them. Richard shook his head. I didn't know how to explain it. Daniel stared at him. You could have told the truth. Richard began crying. I was afraid. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. He had spent years believing his family simply did not care. The truth was more painful. They cared. But fear, pride, and lies had destroyed everything between them. Emily walked toward Daniel. She stopped a few feet away. Daniel. He looked at her. I believe you now. Daniel nodded. But that doesn't fix everything. I know. Emily wiped her tears. I want to fix it. Daniel looked at her. Then start with the truth. She nodded. Then she turned toward the guests. Her voice shook. My brother came here tonight to support me. Everyone listened. We treated him like he was a nobody. She looked at Mark. We laughed at him. Then she looked at her parents. We hid things from him. Her voice broke. And we made him feel ashamed for being exactly who he was. Daniel looked away. He did not want applause. He did not want pity. He only wanted the truth. Then General Harris stepped forward. Colonel. Daniel turned. Harris checked his watch. We have another problem. Daniel's expression became serious. What happened? Harris lowered his voice. The operation tomorrow has changed. Daniel waited. Harris continued. And your unit needs you in the morning. Daniel nodded. I'll be ready. Harris looked at him. There's more. Daniel frowned. How much more? Harris handed him a small sealed envelope. This came from headquarters. Daniel opened it. His eyes moved across the page. Then he stopped. His face became completely serious. Emily noticed. What is it? Daniel looked at her. He did not answer. He looked at Richard. Then at the sealed document. Finally he said quietly. This isn't about the wedding anymore. Everyone waited. Daniel folded the paper. The people I command may be in danger. The room fell silent. And for the first time that night, Daniel's family understood something. The man they had spent hours humiliating was not thinking about revenge anymore. He was thinking about the soldiers who were waiting for him. And by sunrise, Daniel would have to choose between dealing with his broken family and leading his men into the most dangerous mission of his career. The ballroom had changed completely. Only an hour earlier, Daniel had been the man his family wanted to hide. Now everyone was watching him. But Daniel was no longer thinking about the wedding. His mind was on the sealed message from headquarters. His unit needed him. Something had changed with the mission planned for the next morning. General Harris stood beside him. We need to leave soon, he said quietly. Daniel nodded. How soon? Before sunrise. Daniel looked at his sister. Emily was standing near the table, still holding the old documents Robert had given them. She looked frightened. Not because of Daniel's rank. Because she finally understood how much he had kept from the family. Daniel walked toward her. I need to go. Emily nodded. Because of the mission? Yes. She looked down. Will you come back? Daniel paused. He had heard that question many times. From soldiers. From families. From people who had no idea what the answer might cost. He looked at his sister. I'll do everything I can. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Daniel reached into his pocket and took out the small necklace he had given her earlier. You should keep this. Emily looked at it. I thought you gave it to me. I did. Then why are you taking it back? Daniel smiled slightly. I'm not. He closed her hand around it. It's yours. Emily hugged him. This time, Daniel hugged her tightly. For a few seconds the wedding disappeared. They were just brother and sister again. Then Daniel stepped away. Richard was watching from across the room. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. The pride in his face was gone. So was the anger. Only regret remained. He slowly walked toward Daniel. Son. Daniel stopped. Richard struggled to speak. I don't know how to fix this. Daniel looked at him. Neither do I. Richard nodded. I was wrong about you. Daniel said nothing. I spent years thinking you had thrown your life away. Richard's voice shook. But you were doing something I was too afraid to understand. Daniel looked at his father. I never needed you to be impressed. Richard lowered his eyes. I know that now. Daniel wanted to believe him. But trust was not rebuilt in one night. Richard reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small envelope. I should have given you this years ago. Daniel took it. What is it? Your grandfather's last letter. Daniel froze. My grandfather wrote me a letter? Richard nodded. He left it before he died. Daniel stared at the envelope. Why didn't you give it to me? Richard looked ashamed. Because I was angry. Daniel slowly opened it. The letter was short. His grandfather had written about both children. He said Daniel had always been the quiet one. The one who watched. The one who protected others without asking for praise. His final words were simple. Never let people decide your worth for you. Daniel read the sentence twice. His eyes became wet. He folded the letter carefully. Richard watched him. I should have listened to him, he whispered. Daniel looked at his father. So should I. Richard looked surprised. Daniel continued. I spent years trying to prove I was worth something. He shook his head. I should have stopped caring sooner. Richard nodded. I understand. Daniel looked toward the ballroom. Hundreds of people were still watching. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked impressed. Others looked confused. Daniel did not care. He had spent too much of his life worrying about what people thought. Tonight was different. Then Mark approached. He looked nervous. Daniel. Daniel turned. Mark stood there without his earlier confidence. I owe you an apology. Daniel waited. Mark swallowed. What I said tonight was wrong. Daniel looked at him. Which part? Mark's face tightened. All of it. Daniel said nothing. Mark continued. I judged you. Yes. I thought you had nothing. You did. Mark looked down. I was wrong. Daniel nodded. That's true. Mark expected something else. A handshake. A smile. Maybe forgiveness. Daniel gave him none of them. You don't have to like me, Daniel said. Mark looked up. But don't ever mistake quietness for weakness again. Mark nodded. He walked away. Emily watched him. Then she looked at Daniel. You didn't forgive him. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Why? Because forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. Emily nodded. He understood. Across the room, Richard approached Mark's father. Robert was waiting. Richard looked uncomfortable. Robert. Richard. I owe you an apology too. Robert nodded. You do. Richard took a breath. I lied about the land. Robert looked at him. I know. I was desperate. I know that too. Richard looked at Daniel. But I will not sell it. Daniel heard him. He turned. Richard continued. The property belongs to my children. Daniel looked at Emily. She nodded. For the first time that night, something between them felt honest. Then General Harris stepped forward. Colonel. Daniel turned. Harris handed him another document. Daniel looked at it. What is this? Your official commendation. Daniel frowned. Sir, I don't need it. Harris smiled. You don't. He looked around the ballroom. But they might. Daniel opened the document. It described years of service. Leadership. Sacrifice. Decisions made under pressure. There were no dramatic stories. No heroic claims. Just facts. Harris turned toward the guests. Daniel never talked about these things. He paused. That was his choice. The room remained silent. But I will say this. Harris looked at Daniel. I have watched this man lead soldiers when things went wrong. He looked at the guests. He never asked them to do something he would not do himself. Daniel looked down. Harris continued. That is the kind of leader people follow. Richard closed his eyes. His son had spent years trying to make him proud. Yet his father had never once asked what Daniel had actually done. Now hundreds of strangers knew. And Daniel had never even wanted them to know. Harris stepped back. Daniel took a slow breath. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. The caller was one of his senior soldiers. Daniel answered. Colonel. Go ahead. We have confirmation. Daniel's expression changed. Are you certain? Yes, sir. Daniel became very still. Harris immediately noticed. What happened? Daniel ended the call. He looked at the general. The situation is worse than we thought. Harris nodded. That's what headquarters said. Daniel looked toward the ballroom. His family was staring at him again. This time they were not judging him. They were worried. Daniel walked toward Emily. I have to leave. She nodded. I know. He looked at his mother. Linda was crying. I'll call when I can. She nodded. Then Daniel looked at Richard. His father stepped closer. I want you to come back. Daniel looked at him. I'll try. Richard's eyes filled with tears. That's all I can ask. Daniel nodded. He turned toward the exit. Then Emily called his name. He stopped. She ran toward him. She handed him the necklace. Daniel looked confused. I thought you wanted me to keep it. I do. She closed his hand around it. Take it with you. Daniel smiled. Why? Because you gave it to me when you thought you were the one protecting me. She wiped her tears. Now let me protect something for you. Daniel looked at her. What? Your way home. Daniel smiled. For the first time that night he looked like the older brother she remembered. He hugged her. Then he walked outside. General Harris followed. The hotel doors closed behind them. The music inside slowly started again. But nobody was celebrating anymore. They were thinking about the man they had called a failure. The man they had mocked. The man they had tried to hide. Richard stood alone near the entrance. He looked at the empty doorway. Then he noticed something on the floor. A small black card. He picked it up. It had Daniel's name printed on it. Under the name were several words. Richard read them. His face went pale. He looked toward Robert. What is this? Robert stepped closer. He read the card. Then he looked at Richard. You really didn't know? Richard shook his head. Know what? Robert pointed to the final line. It was not Daniel's rank. It was something else. Something far more serious. The card showed that Daniel had been chosen for a special national command. A position even higher than the one his family had just discovered. Richard stared at it. His voice was barely a whisper. He's leaving tomorrow? Robert nodded. No. He looked toward the hotel doors. He's not just leaving tomorrow. Richard looked at him. Then what? Robert's face became serious. He's going where very few people are ever sent. Inside the ballroom, Emily heard the words. She turned toward the doors. And suddenly, the family realized that the wedding had not revealed Daniel's biggest secret. It had only revealed the first one. By the time Daniel reached the hotel parking lot, the wedding music had almost stopped. The lights from the ballroom shone through the tall windows. Inside, his family stood in silence. Outside, a black military vehicle waited. General Harris opened the door. Colonel. Daniel looked back at the hotel. His sister was standing near the glass doors. She was holding the silver necklace he had given her. Daniel raised his hand. Emily raised hers. Then Daniel got into the vehicle. The door closed. The vehicle pulled away. For the first time that night, Daniel felt calm. He had spent years thinking his family did not understand him. Now he knew the truth. They had judged him without ever asking who he really was. But Daniel had no interest in humiliating them. He did not want revenge in the way Mark had expected. He wanted something simpler. He wanted the truth. And the truth had already done more damage than any angry speech could have done. The next morning, Daniel left with his unit. The mission was difficult. There was no room for mistakes. For several days his family heard nothing. Emily kept her phone beside her. Every sound made her look at the screen. Richard barely slept. He kept thinking about the wedding. He remembered every cruel word. Every laugh. Every time Daniel had stood alone. He finally understood something painful. His son had not been trying to impress anyone. He had simply been trying to be loved. And Richard had made him feel unwanted. A week later, the family received a message. Daniel was safe. The mission had ended. No details were included. But the message was enough. Emily cried when she read it. Richard sat quietly beside her. Linda held his hand. For once, nobody argued. Then another message arrived. It was from Daniel. I'm coming home. Emily smiled through her tears. Richard looked at the message for a long time. What should we say when he arrives? Emily looked at him. The truth. Richard nodded. That evening, Daniel returned home. There was no military ceremony. No crowd. No cameras. He arrived at his father's house wearing plain clothes. Emily opened the door. She did not say anything. She simply hugged him. Daniel hugged her back. You came home. I said I would try. She smiled. You did more than try. Daniel stepped inside. His parents were waiting. Richard stood first. He looked at his son. I owe you an apology. Daniel nodded. I know. Richard took a breath. I was ashamed of you. Daniel looked at him. Richard continued. Not because you were a failure. He shook his head. Because I was afraid. Daniel waited. I was afraid that one day I would get a call telling me you were gone. Richard's voice broke. So I convinced myself that your life was not important. Daniel looked down. That makes no sense. I know. Richard wiped his eyes. I thought if I treated your career like it meant nothing, I would not be so afraid of losing you. Daniel was silent. Then he said, You should have told me. I should have. Richard stepped closer. I cannot change what I did. No. But I can change what I do now. Daniel looked at him. What do you want? Richard answered honestly. A chance. Daniel thought for a moment. Then start by telling the truth. Richard nodded. There is something else. Daniel waited. Richard reached into a drawer. He pulled out the old family property papers. I transferred the land. Daniel looked at the documents. To Emily and you. Daniel shook his head. You don't have to give me anything. I know. Richard smiled sadly. This isn't a gift. He placed the papers on the table. It's yours. Daniel looked at the documents. For years that land had been a symbol of family. Now it felt different. It was no longer something that could be used to control him. It was simply his grandfather's final wish. Daniel signed the papers. Then he pushed them toward Emily. She looked confused. What are you doing? You keep the house. Daniel smiled. I don't need it. Emily shook her head. No. Daniel looked at her. You were always the one who loved that place more. Emily began crying. Daniel. He smiled. It's okay. For the first time they were dividing something without fighting. The family began rebuilding slowly. Not perfectly. Not quickly. But honestly. Richard stopped telling people that Daniel had a normal government job. He stopped hiding his son's career. But something unexpected happened. Daniel asked him to stop telling people about it. Richard looked surprised. Why? Because I don't want people treating me differently. Richard smiled. I understand now. The news of Daniel's command had already spread through the small town. People who had ignored him before suddenly wanted to meet him. Old friends called. Business owners invited him to dinners. People who had laughed at his simple clothes suddenly treated him with respect. Daniel turned all of them down. He did not need new admirers. He had learned a hard lesson. Respect that comes only after someone discovers your power is not real respect. Then came the final part of the revenge. Mark called Emily. He wanted to meet Daniel. Emily asked why. Mark said he wanted to apologize. Daniel agreed to meet him. They sat in a quiet coffee shop. Mark looked different. He was no longer confident. No expensive suit. No jokes. No crowd around him. He looked like an ordinary man. I was wrong, Mark said. Daniel nodded. Yes. I judged you. Yes. I thought you were nobody. Daniel looked at him. And now? Mark gave a weak smile. Now everyone knows who you are. Daniel leaned back. That's the problem. Mark frowned. What do you mean? Nothing about me changed. Mark was silent. Daniel continued. You changed your opinion because you learned my rank. Mark looked down. Daniel stood. You don't owe me anything. Mark looked up. I want to make it right. You can't. Mark looked hurt. Then what can I do? Daniel answered simply. Don't treat the next person the way you treated me. Mark nodded. That was all Daniel wanted. No public humiliation. No destroyed career. No revenge speech. Just a lesson. Weeks later, Emily finally held a small dinner for the family. Daniel arrived late. He walked into the room. His father stood. His mother smiled. Emily hugged him. Nobody mentioned his rank. Nobody asked about his medals. Nobody tried to impress him. They simply asked how he was doing. Daniel smiled. That mattered more than any military title. After dinner, Daniel stepped outside. He looked at the night sky. Emily joined him. Are you happy? Daniel thought about the question. Yes. Really? He nodded. Because they finally know who you are? Daniel smiled. No. He looked back at the house. They finally stopped trying to decide who I should be. Emily smiled. Then Daniel's phone vibrated. He checked the message. His expression changed. Emily noticed. What is it? Daniel read the message again. It was from General Harris. Congratulations, Colonel. The promotion has been approved. Emily smiled. Another promotion? Daniel nodded. What does that mean? Daniel looked at the house. It means more responsibility. Are you going to tell Dad? Daniel smiled. Maybe later. Emily laughed. You really are terrible at showing off. Daniel laughed too. Then his phone vibrated again. Another message. This one was different. It came from an unknown number. Daniel opened it. There was only one sentence. Your family was not the only reason they underestimated you. Daniel's smile disappeared. Emily looked at him. What happened? Daniel slowly put the phone away. Nothing. But he knew that was not true. The wedding had ended. The family conflict was finally healing. The humiliation was over. Yet someone else had been watching. Someone who knew Daniel's military history. Someone who knew about his new promotion. Someone who should not have had his private number. Daniel looked toward the dark road outside the house. For years his family had believed his silence meant weakness. They were wrong. His silence had been discipline. And now Daniel knew something else. The greatest revenge was never making his family suffer. It was becoming strong enough that their judgment could no longer control him. But as he stood beneath the quiet night sky, Daniel understood that his story was not completely over. His family had finally learned the truth. Now someone else had just reminded him that secrets have a way of finding the people who are ready to face them.